A black man parked his old fishing boat by the quiet edge of a lake, hoping for nothing more than peace and memory of his father. But within minutes, a white man with a clipboard stormed up, loud and certain, ordering him to leave. He called him a trespasser, claimed the lake wasn't for people like him, and threatened to call the sheriff. What this man didn't know was that the person he was trying to chase away wasn't just a visitor. He was the owner of the entire lake, and soon their whole fishing club would be evicted. Clarence Rucker was a man who valued peace over everything else. In his late 50s, with hands worn from years of hard work, he carried himself with quiet dignity. Every weekend, he made his way to the same small lake tucked away behind a cluster of homes. It wasn't just water to him. It was memory, heritage, and healing. His father had bought the land decades ago, a place where Clarence had learned how to fish as a boy and where he now went to find calm after a long week. The lake itself was calm and beautiful. Early mornings filled the surface with mist, and by noon the sun sparkled across the water like a field of diamonds. To Clarence, this wasn't just property. It was the last piece of his father's legacy, one he intended to protect. But to the homeowners association of the nearby subdivision, it was something else entirely. Their playground. Over the years, they had grown used to fishing there, gathering there, even treating it as if it belonged to them. Most of the neighbors were polite enough, nodding when they saw Clarence, but there were always a few who carried themselves differently. They saw him as an outsider, even though he had deeper roots in the land than anyone else. The unspoken looks, the muttered comments, the subtle reminders that he didn't fit in. Clarence had grown used to it. He didn't fight back. He didn't argue. He let their arrogance slide because the peace of the lake meant more to him than pointless battles. But one afternoon, as Clarence cast his line into the water, peace gave way to confrontation. A man from the HOA walked toward him, clipboard in hand, ready to start a fight he didn't realize he couldn't win. The man who approached Clarence that afternoon was named Richard Palmer, a mid-level manager who had recently been elected to the local HOA board. Tall, pale, and always carrying himself like he owned every place he walked into, Richard thrived on rules and authority. To him, control wasn't about keeping order. It was about keeping people in their place. Richard spotted Clarence's boat tied neatly at the dock, his fishing gear set up on the grass, and instantly scowled. He didn't see a man enjoying his land. He saw someone who didn't belong, someone who, in his mind, was breaking the rules. "Hey!" Richard barked, though Clarence didn't flinch. Years of enduring worse had taught him to stay calm. Slowly, he reeled in his line and looked up. Richard stood there, arms crossed, clipboard clutched like a badge of power. "This area is private," Richard said flatly. "You can't park your boat here, you can't fish here, you need to move." Clarence stayed quiet for a moment. He had learned that silence often spoke louder than words. He simply studied the man, wondering what made him so certain, so bold, so entitled. But Richard took Clarence's silence as defiance. His voice rose. "Don't play games with me. I know exactly what you're doing. You're trespassing. People like you always think they can get away with things. Not here. Not on my watch." The words stung, not because Clarence hadn't heard them before, but because they carried the same venom he'd known his whole life, prejudice dressed up as authority. Around them, a few neighbors began to gather. They watched, whispering among themselves, their eyes darting back and forth between Clarence and Richard. Some looked uncomfortable, others curious, and a few smirked as if they were enjoying the show. Clarence's jaw tightened, but he remained seated in his boat, his hands steady on the reel. Richard mistook this calm for weakness. He leaned closer, jabbing a finger toward the water. "If you don't move this boat right now, I'll have the sheriff down here in 10 minutes, Richard sneered. "The HOA doesn't allow outsiders to use this lake. You people should learn to follow the rules." The crowd grew thicker, the whispers louder. Clarence could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on him. They didn't know the truth. They didn't know the history, and Richard was feeding them a story that painted him as the defender of their community. Clarence thought of his father in that moment, the man who had worked 2 jobs to buy this land when nobody thought he could. He thought of the summers spent learning patience at this very lake, casting his line beside the man who taught him dignity in the face of hate. Richard had no idea. None of them did. And Clarence realized this wasn't just about fishing anymore. This was about respect, ownership, and the years of quiet endurance that people like Richard mistook for weakness. He stood slowly, rising to his full height, his presence commanding even without words. The whispers stopped. Richard's smirk faltered for just a second. Clarence didn't shout, didn't argue, didn't explain, not yet. Instead, he looked Richard squarely in the eye and said calmly, "You've made a mistake." The crowd leaned in, waiting. Richard scoffed, already preparing his next threat. But what he didn't realize was that his entire fishing club, his sense of power and his claim over the lake were about to crumble. The tension was thick in the air. Neighbors stood shoulder to shoulder, their eyes locked on Clarence and Richard, as if watching a spectacle unfold. Richard puffed out his chest, certain he had cornered a trespasser who would soon be escorted off his lake. But Clarence wasn't shaken. He had carried burdens far heavier than a man with a clipboard and an inflated ego. He let the silence linger just long enough to make Richard uncomfortable before finally stepping onto the dock. His voice was steady, deep, and deliberate. "You keep calling this your lake," Clarence said, his eyes fixed on Richard. "But tell me, since when do you own it?" Richard let out a mocking laugh. "Don't play smart with me. This lake belongs to the Homeowners Association. We've used it for years. You don't live here, so you have no rights." Clarence reached into his weathered satchel, pulling out a thin leather folder. He opened it carefully, as though it held something sacred, and in truth it did. Inside were the original deeds to the land, papers his father had signed decades ago. Clarence held them up for the crowd to see. "This lake," he said firmly, "was bought and paid for by my father before this subdivision even existed. He worked his hands raw to give us this land, and when he passed, it came to me. So if anyone here is trespassing, it's not me, it's you." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Richard's smirk disappeared, his face draining of color. He stammered, his voice cracking. That can't be. The HOA?" "The HOA owns nothing here," Clarence cut in sharply. "Every fish you've caught, every gathering you've held, every time you've acted like this was your property, you've been standing on mine." The silence was deafening. The neighbors who had once whispered now stood frozen, ashamed, their eyes darting away from Clarence's steady gaze. Richard, red with humiliation, tried to recover, but the weight of the truth crushed him. Clarence didn't need to shout or threaten. The power had always been his, and now, in front of everyone, the illusion of control Richard clung to had shattered completely. After Clarence revealed the deed, the silence on the lakefront was almost painful. The neighbors shifted uneasily, whispering among themselves, realizing the truth they had ignored for years. All their fishing tournaments, barbecues, and meetings by the water had been done without permission. The man they had dismissed as an intruder was, in fact, the rightful owner of everything they thought was theirs. Richard's face twisted with anger, but there was nothing left for him to say. The evidence was undeniable. The arrogance he wore so proudly now looked pitiful, and every eye was on him, not with respect, but with quiet judgment. Clarence didn't need to humiliate him further. The truth had already done that. In the weeks that followed, Clarence exercised his rights as the property owner. The fishing club was disbanded, their events were shut down, and the HOA was formally barred from accessing the water. For the first time in years, Clarence had the lake to himself again, just as his father had intended. Sitting by the shore, he felt the peace he had long sought return, the stillness broken only by the gentle splash of water against his boat. But this wasn't just about land or ownership. It was about dignity. For too long, people like Clarence had been told they didn't belong, even in spaces they had every right to claim. This moment wasn't just a personal victory. It was a reminder that history carries weight and that truth has the power to silence prejudice. And yet one question lingered in the minds of those who witnessed it. How many other Clarences have been pushed aside, doubted, or dismissed simply because of the color of their skin? Sometimes justice doesn't come from raising your voice. It comes from standing firm in who you are and letting the truth speak louder than hate. So the next time you see someone being treated like they don't belong, remember Clarence's story. Remember that appearances deceive, and power doesn't always look like what you expect. Because sometimes, the man they try to push away is the one who holds the ground beneath their feet. If you've experienced or witnessed injustice, share your story in the comments. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video so together we can spread the message further.